The whole room went quiet the moment she rolled in. Not the polite kind of quiet that falls when someone important walks through a door. The sharp, uncomfortable kind, where conversations don't stop so much as collapse, and everyone finds something fascinating to stare at that isn't her. I noticed it before I noticed her. I was standing near the service corridor at the back of the Rosewater Ballroom at the Fairmont Château Laurier in Ottawa, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to my belt, doing exactly what junior event coordinators are supposed to do at black tie fundraisers, staying invisible. The Canadian Children's Literacy Gala was the biggest event on our company's calendar that year. 300 guests, senator families, Bay Street money, tech founders from Waterloo and Vancouver. The kind of room where people wore their net worth on their lapels and talked about philanthropy like it was a competitive sport. My name is Noah. I was 29, making $32,000 a year plus overtime, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in Vanier with a roommate who collected vintage hockey jerseys and left the milk out. My father had been on disability since a warehouse accident in Hamilton crushed 2 vertebrae in his lower back. My mother was working night shifts at a long-term care home in Brampton to help cover what WSIB didn't. I had taken the event coordination job because it paid in cash at the end of every shift, and I needed every dollar I could scrape together. I was not supposed to be on that ballroom floor. I was supposed to be checking fire exit signage and making sure the catering team had enough serving spoons. But I was watching a woman sit alone beside a table that everyone else had quietly abandoned. Her name was Ingrid Blackwell. I didn't know that yet. What I knew was this. She was maybe 30, with light brown hair pinned back in a way that suggested she had gotten dressed carefully for tonight. Her gown was deep burgundy, floor length, with a structured bodice that looked like it had been chosen with precision, the kind of dress that says I am here and I belong here. She sat in a motorized wheelchair, and the left side of her body, from the back of her hand to the curve of her jaw, was marked with visible scarring. The kind that comes from something that happened fast and left slowly, burn scars. Healed but unmistakably present, and the people around her, the investment bankers with their gleaming cufflinks, the tech executives in their tailored suits, the women in cocktail dresses clutching wine glasses, had formed a slow, unconscious circle of absence around her. No one was cruel about it, sneered or pointed. That would have been almost easier to watch. Instead, it was polite invisibility. The kind of exclusion that doesn't know it's exclusion. The program director had just announced a brief reception dance before dinner, and couples were drifting toward the center of the room. The string quartet began something slow and familiar. I think it was a Norah Jones arrangement, though I couldn't be sure over the ambient noise of the room. Men offered their hands to their wives, to their dates, to women they had just met. Partners turned toward each other, the floor filled. Ingrid stayed where she was. She wasn't looking at the floor with longing. She wasn't scanning the room with hope. She looked like someone who had already done the math on this situation a long time ago and had simply arrived at an answer she no longer bothered to question. There was a tiredness in her posture that had nothing to do with the hour. I have thought about that expression 100 times since then. There's a kind of exhaustion that only comes from being chronically unseen, not ignored in the rude, deliberate way, just moved around, like furniture. My radio crackled. My supervisor, a tightly wound man named Don, who ran events with the energy of someone defusing a bomb, muttered something about the centerpieces on table 9 being half a foot off axis. I turned the volume down. I don't know exactly what happened in the 10 seconds after that. Something in me just made a decision that my brain hadn't finished processing yet. I set my clipboard on a linen-covered tray table near the wall. I walked across the ballroom. The distance was maybe 40 feet. It felt longer. The floor was polished to a mirror finish, and my dress shoes were slightly too big. I had borrowed them from my roommate, and I was aware of every single step. I was aware that I was a nobody in a room full of people who would never hire a man like me for anything more than carrying their bags. I was aware that the woman I was walking toward was the only daughter of Reginald Blackwell, the founder and chairman of Blackwell Capital Management, one of the largest private equity firms in the country. A man who had been profiled in the Globe and Mail 3 times in the last decade. A man who, it was whispered tonight, could write a check for this entire gala's fundraising target without checking his balance first. I was also aware that none of that was the reason I was walking. When I reached her, I stopped. She looked up. Brown eyes, steady, waiting for whatever I was about to do wrong. I said, "I'm a terrible dancer. I want to be honest about that up front. But the floor's half empty and this song is too good to waste. Would you dance with me? For a moment she didn't say anything. I had the distinct impression she was deciding whether I was being genuine or whether this was some kind of performance for the benefit of someone watching. I understood that. I would have had the same thought. Then she said, I don't get to dance much at these things. That seems like a waste, I said. She looked at me for another second, moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was on its way there. She said, yes. So we moved onto the floor together, her chair, my borrowed shoes. Neither of us fully certain of the geometry of this. We found a rhythm. I held her hand and moved slowly in a kind of gentle sway that was more instinct than choreography. I kept my eyes on her face, not on the scars, not on the chair, on her face. She had a small constellation of freckles across her nose that I remember thinking was a detail the world was probably missing. The room did not stop. People kept dancing, kept talking, kept sipping their wine, but I felt the shift anyway. The particular atmospheric pressure change of 300 people recalibrating something they thought they understood. Halfway through the song, she said, "You work here." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "Why are you doing this?" I thought about it for a second. I said, "Because no one else was." She nodded once, slowly, like that was an answer she hadn't heard in a while and wasn't sure she trusted yet. We kept dancing. The song ended. The quartet transitioned into something livelier and the couples around us picked up the pace. Ingrid released my hand. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully name. Gratitude, yes, but also something older and more careful. Like someone who has been handed something they want very much but have learned not to hold on to too tightly. She said, "I won't forget this." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "Neither will I." I went back to my clipboard. Dawn glared at me from across the room. The centerpieces on table 9 were still off axis. I thought that was the whole story. I was wrong. 3 days later, I was at my desk in the tiny office our company shared above a print shop on Spark Street, eating a pita wrap and sending follow-up emails to vendors, when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the line introduced herself as Helen Ford, executive assistant to Reginald Blackwell. She asked if I was available to come in for a conversation at the Blackwell Capital offices at a time convenient to me that week. The elevator ride to the 31st floor of the Blackwell Capital building on Bay Street in Toronto was one of the longest of my life, and I took it alone, in borrowed dress shoes again because I still hadn't bought my own. Reginald Blackwell met me himself. He was a tall man in his late 60s, trim, with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who has decades in rooms where stillness communicates power. He shook my hand, gestured to a chair across from his desk, and sat down. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "My daughter has attended 14 charity events in the past 3 years. In 14 events, no one outside of her immediate family has asked her to dance, or to sit with them, or, in most cases, to continue a conversation past the point of basic social obligation." He paused. "She told me about you." I said, "I just didn't want her to be alone." He said, "I know, that's why you're here." What followed was not a job offer in the traditional sense. Reginald explained that the Blackwell Foundation, separate from Blackwell Capital, a charitable arm his late wife, Ingrid's mother, had established before she died, was in the process of expanding its accessibility and inclusion programs across Ontario. They were looking for someone to help coordinate outreach events, specifically designed to bring together the disability community, burn survivor networks, and corporate donors in spaces that felt genuinely welcome and performatively inclusive. Someone with event coordination experience. Someone who, in his words, seemed to understand that the point of a room full of people was for everyone in it to feel like they belonged there. He was offering me the position. The salary was more than double what I was making. It included benefits, the kind that covered physiotherapy and prescription costs, which mattered to me because of my father. There was transit and parking support. There was a professional development fund. I told him I needed to think about it. He said that was the right answer, and that he'd expect nothing less. I called my mother from a bench outside the building. It was November in Toronto, cold enough that my breath came out in small clouds, and she was on her break between shifts, sitting in the staff room of the long-term care home in Brampton, and when I told her what had happened, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father is going to cry when I tell him. She was right." He did. I said yes to the position the next morning. I want to be careful here about what I say next because it would be easy to make this into a simple story. Boy crosses ballroom, boy gets girl, everyone wins. That's not what happened. What happened was more complicated and more real than that. Ingrid and I didn't fall into anything easily. We worked together on the foundation events for months before we were anything other than colleagues. She was careful with people in a way that made complete sense once I understood her history. What I'm about to tell you, I learned gradually, in pieces, the way you learn things about someone you're beginning to trust. 4 years before the gala, Ingrid had been driving home from a weekend trip to Algonquin Park with 2 university friends. It was early spring and the road conditions on Highway 60 near Huntsville were worse than they looked. Black ice under a light dusting of snow. A transport truck coming from the opposite direction lost control on a downgrade. The crash was catastrophic. Both of her friends survived with serious injuries. The car caught fire on impact. Ingrid pulled one of them out. She was 26 years old, alone on a highway shoulder, with flames already reaching the chassis, and she went back into a burning car. She got Mara out. She got her to the tree line. She went back for the other, her friend Colin. But the fire had spread too fast by then, and a man who had stopped on the road physically pulled Ingrid back before she could reach him. Collins survived. He was pulled out by firefighters 12 minutes later, but those 12 minutes nearly killed him. The burns to Ingrid's hand, arm, and face were treated over 18 months of surgeries and skin grafts at the Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto. She went through the procedures. She did the physiology. She recovered as fully as the word recovered can apply to something like that. What she didn't recover easily from was the world after. The media covered the accident and her actions with the particular intensity of a story that arrives at a slow news time. She was celebrated. There were interviews, a provincial commendation, a small ceremony. Ingrid attended them all because she felt she owed it to Mara and Colin to let their survival be acknowledged. And then the cycle ended, as cycles do, and she was left in a world that still looked at her face and flinched. She told me once, during a late evening after a foundation event in Hamilton, sitting in the car park while the rest of the team wrapped up inside. The hardest part wasn't the pain, the surgeries were pain. You get through pain. The hardest part was going somewhere and watching people decide in the first half second what I was to them, and having no way to change that decision no matter what I said or did next. She said it quietly, not bitterly. That was the thing about Ingrid. She had long since moved past bitterness into something more honest, a clear-eyed accounting of how the world operated that she had chosen not to let define her ceiling. She had stopped going to public events for almost a year before the gala. Her father had convinced her to attend that one, specifically because of the literacy focus. Ingrid had a background in early childhood education and cared deeply about reading access for kids in northern and remote communities. She had stood in that ballroom and done the math the same way she always did and had arrived at the answer she always arrived at. She would not be approached. She would exist at the periphery. She would leave early. I interrupted the math. I don't say that proudly. I say it factually. I wasn't brave at the gala. I was just the only person in that particular room on that particular evening who happened to be paying attention and happened to lack the social programming that made everyone else look away. Maybe that came from being raised by parents who couldn't afford the luxury of looking away from things that made them uncomfortable. I don't know. I don't want to overanalyze what I did because I don't think it was remarkable. I think it was basic. The remarkable thing was that basic turned out to be rare. The work at the foundation was hard and genuine. In the first year, we organized 11 events across Ontario, in Ottawa, Toronto, Kingston, Sudbury, and Thunder Bay. The events were designed around a simple principle that Ingrid had articulated clearly in one of our first planning meetings. Accessibility is not a ramp and a large print menu. Accessibility is the experience of arriving somewhere and feeling like the space was built for you, not retrofitted to tolerate you. We brought in burn survivors to speak at corporate fundraising breakfasts. We organized mentorship circles that connected young people living with visible differences to professionals across various sectors. We partnered with the Rick Hansen Foundation on an audit of our own venues before we booked them. We made mistakes and corrected them and made different mistakes and corrected those too. Ingrid was extraordinary at this work. She had a precision of vision and a quiet authority in a room that came partly from her background and partly from knowing firsthand exactly what was at stake. She was also funny. Dryly, precisely funny in a way that caught you off guard. The kind of humor that doesn't announce itself, that trusts you to keep up. I liked that about her from early on and kept liking it. There were setbacks. There were always setbacks. A profile piece that ran in a national magazine in the spring of the second year managed, despite good intentions, to frame the Foundation's work in a way that centered Reginald's wealth rather than Ingrid's leadership. She read it in silence on a Friday afternoon in the Foundation office in Toronto. I watched her read it. I watched her set it down on the desk. I watched her look out the window at the CN Tower in the middle distance for about 45 seconds. Then she said, "I'd like to do a proper press Q&A about the Thunder Bay program. Can we schedule that for next week?" That was who she was. There were comments on the social media posts the magazine ran. I didn't tell her about most of them. The ones I couldn't protect her from, she read herself. One evening she showed me her phone across the Foundation boardroom table without comment. Just handed it to me and waited. The comment she was showing me questioned whether the Foundation would have received any attention without her father's name attached to it, whether her own public presence was helpful or harmful to the brand, whether someone with her appearance should be, quote, the face of anything. I gave the phone back. I said, "In 6 months, we've helped fund reading programs for 431 kids in communities north of the 50th parallel. That's the brand." She took the phone back and put it face down on the table. She said, "I know. I just needed to hear someone else say it. I understood that. There are things you know to be true that still need to be spoken by another human voice before they fully take root in you." The turn came gradually, the way real things do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of small ones. The moment she started showing up to events without the silk scarf she had sometimes worn in the early months. The first time she disagreed with a donor, publicly and firmly, and without apology when he suggested that the survivor speaker's might be too graphic for a breakfast audience. The afternoon in Sudbury when she spoke at a high school and a girl of about 15, with a visible skin condition across her face and neck, waited until after the talk and approached Ingrid alone and said something to her, in a voice too quiet for me to hear, and Ingrid leaned down and spoke back to her for maybe 2 minutes. And when they separated, the girl was crying, but in the way that means something has been released rather than something lost. I was standing across the room, and I had to look at the ceiling for a second. The Foundation's annual report at the end of year 2 showed that donations had increased 43%. Program reach had expanded to 7 new communities. 2 of the mentorship participants had been hired into positions at corporate partner organizations. Ingrid's name appeared in 3 separate nominations for provincial recognition of charitable leadership. She did not win any of them, which she found genuinely funny. The optics, she said, entirely deadpan. At a staff lunch the week the final nomination was announced. Imagine. We went back to the Fairmont Château Laurier in Ottawa the following spring. The Canadian Children's Literacy Gala. 1 year and a few months from the night I had walked across that floor. This time Ingrid arrived without the advanced scouting she had admitted she used to do, figuring out sightlines, identifying the least conspicuous table, mapping the quickest route to the exit. She arrived the way someone arrives when they have decided the room belongs to them as much as anyone else, which is to say, simply she arrived. When the string quartet began and the floor opened, she turned to me first. I said, "Seriously, I haven't gotten any better." She said, "I know. I don't care." We moved back onto that same floor in that same room, and nothing about it was the same as before. There were no stairs this time, or if there were, neither of us noticed. The room had learned something, or maybe she had decided to stop giving the room's opinion the authority it used to hold over her. I'm not sure the distinction matters. Near the end of the song, she said something to me that I haven't repeated to many people. She said that for the year after the accident, she had genuinely believed that a certain version of her life was simply over, that the things she had imagined for herself, presence, connection, the simple act of being in a room and feeling like she fit there, had been burned away along with everything else. She said the night in that ballroom the year before had not fixed anything, had not suddenly made the world different, had not erased a single comment or averted gaze or moment of polite invisibility, but it had reminded her of something she had stopped believing. She said, "You made it feel possible again. Not easy, just possible." I think that's actually more useful. I have turned that sentence over in my mind many times since. If you've been the person standing at the edge of a room because the room didn't seem to be built for you, If you know what it feels like to do the math and come up with the answer that you are not what this place had in mind, I want you to know that someone in your life has probably noticed. Maybe hasn't crossed the floor yet, maybe doesn't know how, maybe just needs to understand that basic can be rare, and rare is enough. If this story means something to you, take a second to leave the word "seen" in the comments, because I think there are a lot of people watching this who know exactly what it costs to walk into a room and choose to stay. Ingrid told me she wouldn't forget me. The truth is, she gave me something too. She reminded me that the smallest decent act, the kind that takes 30 seconds and costs nothing, can land in someone's life and keep going long after the song ends. I'm still paying attention to that.